this is a sort of story about what to do with what you've got. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today, about this parable. Now, bear in mind the setting for this parable. Jesus has laid out before the people around him what he thinks are the most important features of the entire Torah. Out of the 613 commandments and ordinances and statutes in the Torah, he has picked 2 that he believes are most important. We looked and we saw how others in the biblical narrative had made their selections from Torah, and they came up with different things. Micah picks 3 things, Isaiah picks 2, King David picks 10. Jesus picked these 2. And the question then, having picked those 2, is, well, how do you do it? How do you love God with all that you are and all that you have? And how do you love others as much as you love yourselves? And so the teachings of Jesus that follow are basically about this subject, including the thing that we just heard that sounds so strange. So we have been interpreting these teachings in terms of an allegiance model for faith, where you're invited to join yourself to what Jesus portrays as God's great love story. The idea that you should love God as much as you can with everything that you've got. You should love your neighbor as you love yourself. You should love the stranger. You should love your enemy. It's a great big love story, and Jesus says, come and be part of this love story. So you get to choose that. You get to choose whether or not you want to be on that path. And faith in Jesus is another way of allegiance to the teaching, to the way that he provides. And the important thing that Jesus wants us to know and points out in all of these parables is that every step along the path is a choice between siding with the empire. In his day, that was Rome. Today, you can figure out for yourself what that is. You can either side with the empire or you can side with the kingdom. And almost every little decision we make is an empire versus kingdom decision. So, the parable of the talents, as I mentioned, it's a very common parable to use around stewardship time. And the majority reading of it goes something like this. The idea is that we read the parable and we assume that the landowner, the master, the ruler is God, and that the people, that's us. And so what we say is, well, God gives everybody certain talents. Some people are more talented than others. So you might have 5 talents, somebody else has got 2, someone else has only got 1. And we're to use these talents to build up or increase God's kingdom. And God's really happy when we do that and says, good and trustworthy person. And if you don't do it, if you take your talents and you just bury them and you don't use them for growing the kingdom, God gets really mad at you. That's kind of the default reading of this parable, and I've heard it preached that way dozens of times. The problem is that actually doesn't work as, I think, as the best possible reading of this parable. And so I would like to look at that. There are a lot of problems with this majority reading of the parable. The first one is that the master figure, the one who we say, well, that must be God if we're doing an analogical reading, he goes away. He leaves and doesn't come back for a really long time here. Well, in Jesus' day, that was a common practice for absentee landlords to do that. And most of the absentee landlords were Romans. And the Jewish people hated them for this. They would come in with their legion, they'd take over the land, they'd make you farm it all, and the leaders would go back to Rome, which is their home. And then every year they'd come back with their soldiers and they'd collect all of their increase, their taxes and so on from you. And they would take that back to Rome as well. So the locals hated this, and yet that's the character that appears to be God in the story. So that's kind of funny sounding, isn't it? That doesn't sound right. In fact, in the parable, the psalm for today's psalm reading is about the fact that God in Judaism was recognized as being with the people, living with the people. God's abode has been established in Salem, God's dwelling place, the place where God tabernacles or hangs out in Zion. Nowhere, we don't have God just leaving and going away somewhere for long periods of time. That just doesn't happen in the biblical narrative. So that's odd too. And then we read about the slaves, and on the surface, it sounds kind of reasonable. The idea that if somebody gave someone 5 talents, they made 5 more. Someone gets 2 talents, they make 2 more. You think, well, that sounds good. That sounds okay. And on the surface, it sounds fine. And being commended for doing that, on the surface, it sounds fine, like there's nothing wrong with it at all. But there is. And you know there is because the last person who comes up is the third slave, who describes the man, the one that's casting as God in the story, the absentee landlord, as a harsh man who reaps where he did not sow, who gathers where he did not scatter seed, and who causes his slaves to be afraid of him. Well, that doesn't sound like God at all, does it? So there's that. And then the deal breaker, the thing that you read and you think, oh, this can't possibly be right, is this. Because the landowner says to the slave, you should have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return, I would have received what was my own with interest. Now, to us, the idea that you put money in the bank and you get interest on it, I mean, if it's in a savings account or a CD or something, even though the interest rate these days is terrible and you probably shouldn't do it, but that's a separate subject. It sounds reasonable to us, right? That's what people do with their money. But not if you're Jewish at the time of Jesus, because if you're Jewish at the time of Jesus, you know this. You know that if you lend money to your people, especially poor people, you mustn't deal with them with a creditor, and you shall not exact interest from them. It's forbidden in the Torah. Similarly, in Leviticus, do not take interest in advance or otherwise make a profit from people. Do not lend your money at interest. You're not even allowed to sell food for a profit in first century Judaism. Why not? Because these are all methods of oppressing poor people, right? If you've got food and you want to sell it, you just jack the price up and you put a huge burden on the back of the poor people. So it's absolutely forbidden. And in fact, the biblical narrative in the Old Testament has all sorts of interesting things to say about people who lend money at interest. For example, in Ezekiel, it says, if somebody oppresses the poor and needy, does not restore the pledge — a pledge is something you put up as surety for a loan — takes advance or accrued interest. If you go take an interest from people, is that person even worthy to stay alive? And Ezekiel says, no. This is an abomination. These are abominable things to do. The person deserves to die, says Ezekiel. You can't do that. That's unthinkable to do that. So the idea of casting this character as God gets more and more unreasonable as you keep reading it. And then you get to this bit. Now, just listen to the words a minute. This is Jesus. Do you think Jesus is seriously saying this is something that you should buy into? For all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. Does that sound like something Jesus would endorse? No, of course it doesn't. It stands in direct contradiction to almost everything that Jesus teaches. Just as one example, and there are dozens of them, compare this: for to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. Or, from everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. The bottom one sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? The top one? What? Doesn't make any sense. So this majority reading of the parable of the talents, which looks like this, it's just fraught with problems. There's something wrong with that reading, in my opinion. So feel free to disagree with me, of course. Let's do a different reading. This is what I would call a minority reading here. And I think what Jesus is doing is putting forth to you the world in which he is living at that moment, where the absentee landlord in the parable represents Rome. It represents the Roman Empire, because that's what Romans do. That's an empire thing. And the two slaves who trade with the talents on behalf of Rome are the local people who are colluding with the Roman Empire against their own people, because remember, the Romans are the overlords. And the third slave, the one who refuses to collude with the empire, that's the hero of this story. This is the person who resists the empire and will not use the one talent that he was given to multiply the work of the empire. He just won't do it. He buries it in the ground, which might sound weird to us, but it wasn't weird at Jesus' time. That's what you did if you had something of value. You couldn't take it to the bank or something, so you'd sneak out at night, you'd dig a hole, bury it, smooth it all over so nobody knew where it was except for you, and then it would be safe. So he keeps the thing there, but he does not invest it, he does not make money off it, he does not promote the work of the empire. Which means that these words that we read, that make no sense if they come off the lips of Jesus, they make a lot of sense when they come from the lips of the empire. For to all those who have, the rich Romans, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, the local peasants, even what they have will be taken away. It's the creed of the empire right there. So, what does the empire do to somebody who refuses to collude with them, refuses to work for them, refuses to make a profit for them? As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness. And from his friends, the ones who are living within the kingdom, there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, because that's what happened to the person who refused to collude with the empire. So remember, of course, when we're talking about talents, I know everybody in this room knows this, but lots of people don't, that a talent, this is not like talent like in a talent show, right? This is a talent is a measure of gold or some other precious metal like silver, and a talent is about 75 pounds in today's, so it's a lot here. And a talent's the equivalent of 6,000 denarii, and one denarius is 1 day's wages for a laborer, so do the math on that. 1 talent, 6,000 days' wages. 2 talents, 12,000. 5 talents, 30,000. So if you assume that a typical worker works 6 days a week, because they're Jewish, they don't work on the Sabbath, for 52 weeks a year, no breaks at all. A talent works out to somewhere between 19 and 20 years' wages. 2 talents, 5 talents, 96 to 90. So let's just round it off, because I've made all sorts of assumptions, and just say 1 talent's 20 years, 2 talents, 40 years, 5 talents, 100 years' wages. Now these are massive amounts of money, right? They're huge amounts of money that no peasant is ever going to see at one time, ever. And the problem with large amounts of money is that they become, in a sense, unreal to us, I think. It's like when I hear on the television about some federal program or something, and it will say, it's going to cost $1.1 trillion. I'm like, what? You know, how many boxes of cereal is that? You know, it's like, you have no idea what $1.1 trillion is. It's such a ridiculously huge amount of money. So what Jesus is doing here is he's trying to portray ridiculously huge amounts of money, in other words, systemic economics, in terms of the wages of ordinary people, so people will be able to get some grasp on how the empire works systemically here. The hero of the story, remember, refused to use an amount of money, it approximates his lifetime income, it's like 20 odd years worth of money, in collusion with the empire, but the others were willing to profit the empire with amounts so huge that no ordinary person would ever be able to amass such a sum of money. What does that mean? Well, let's circle back to the beginning of the story, where Jesus is telling stories that tell you you've got one life to live, and how will you spend it is really what he's saying. How will you spend this life that you have been gifted? You get to choose a path, and you get to choose your allegiance, and every step on the path is an empire versus kingdom question. All of them. So, the bottom line on the alternative, the minority reading of the parable would say, you can work as a slave to benefit the empire, or you can make a choice to stand apart and side with the kingdom. But the empire wants your money, they want your work, they want you to profit the empire. They don't want you just to leave things sitting in the ground. They want you to put effort in to multiply for them, not for you, for them, your talents, your big piles of gold and silver. That's what they want. So, Let's just think about that in terms of where we're living right now. You know what's coming up, don't you? You've seen the advertisements here. We have Black Friday, Cyber Monday. You've got Christmas shopping to do. You have post-Christmas sales that will be splattered all over the place here. These are all coming up. These are all ways that the empire wants your money. We know this, right? Somebody nod. Good, good. I'm encouraged. I just wanted to pick one of them just to talk about for a minute. So let's just do Christmas here. Christmas, according to the kingdom, looks like this picture in the top left. The Christmas story goes like this. There are two peasants, a young girl and a guy, who've got nowhere to go, nowhere to lay down, nowhere for the girl to have her baby. They wind up in this filthy, horrible place with straw and hay and animals and animal excrement and animal fodder. And it's just a messy story about people living at the very bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum. And in the midst of that story, what happens? God appears somehow, bringing hope to the people right there in the form of a little baby. That's what happens in the story. And we turned it into that in the bottom right-hand corner. Massive piles of Christmas presents for people and stuff like that, right? So the top one is like, that's what the kingdom says Christmas looks like, and the bottom one is what the empire says Christmas looks like. It looks like that. Am I making this up? I'm not making this up. Last year at Christmas, according to one of the companies that does retail surveys for stores and things, so they know what to expect for the coming year, the Deloitte company, this is how much they say the average household spent on Christmas. Total of $1,230 per household. That was last year. This year, astonishingly, they estimate that each household will spend an additional $228. That's a huge jump. The jump gets you to $1,458 per household. Let's just round it off and call it $1,500 just for. And what that means, of course, is that for every one of my friends that doesn't celebrate Christmas, like two of my friends, I have two friends who are Hindus, they don't have any little kids, so they don't get the pressure from the kids, like, well, everybody else got a Christmas present, why can't I? So they just basically completely ignore Christmas. It's like it never happened because it's not their thing. They don't do it. So their spending for Christmas is zero. So to get the average to $1,500, somebody else is going to have to spend $3,000, right? And so on. And you just do that in your head and you think, what? The empire puts out this message that calls for us to focus on the perfect Christmas. Don't you want the perfect Christmas? Perfect decorations, perfect Christmas deal, dinner, perfect family, which means it won't be my family, the perfect family gathered together, no arguing, for everybody singing Christmas carols while the fire is crackling and so on and so forth. We can blame Norman Rockwell for this because no such Christmas exists that looks like that, right? Have you ever had one? The perfect Christmas? No, of course not. So it's set before you as the unattainable ideal, and you're told it's worth it at any price. Even if you have to go borrow money for it, even if you have to buy all those things on your credit card, it'll be worth it because it'll be perfect. That's what the empire tells you. It's the message, it's the Christmas message of the empire. There it is. But the first Christmas, of course, was really messy. It's just like life today. It's really messy. It was dirty. It was scruffy. And God shows up in the middle of all of that to bring a message of hope to people, which is what the Christmas story is about, right? It's about God appearing somehow in the form of this child that brings hope into the world. And it doesn't look anything like the empire here. So I get this message from my bank. This just came. It was so irritating to me. You really can have less stress this holiday. There are things you can do to spare your wallet and your nerves, manage your holiday spending. It's all about borrowing money to spend at Christmas. I'm like, what? Come on. It's horrible. So I just wanted to instead tell a short story here about, it's to do with this parable of the talents. What do you do with what you've got? So here in Ohio, there's this guy whose name's Mike Slaughter. Mike wrote this book called Christmas Is Not Your Birthday. Now, Mike is the pastor, well, he's just retired actually, but he was the pastor for many, many years of the largest United Methodist church in Ohio, and it's in Ginghamsburg. You ever heard of Ginghamsburg, anybody? Some of you have. Ginghamsburg is nowhere. It's like right out in the middle of the field somewhere. And when Mike first went there was a tiny little United Methodist church. The building is actually smaller than this one. And a handful of people going to church there. And Mike went in and started talking about the gospel. And he started talking about making kingdom decisions instead of empire decisions. And it took him no time at all to drive everybody out of that church, because the Jesus that he was talking about didn't sound like the Jesus that they grew up with. This Jesus was the Jesus who was radically in favor of helping the homeless and those who had nothing to eat and those who had nowhere to go, just like Mary and Joseph, for example. And so he did that, and he just drove everybody away. They basically all left. There was almost nobody there. And then a few people drifted in who listened to his message, and then a few more. And now, if you go to Ginghamsburg, they kept the little building as they built this huge campus there. And now they have, I don't know, last time I looked, they had about 5,500 people going to church there on Sunday. And if you would ever go to church there, what you would discover is that Mike is a classic introvert. He really dislikes standing in front of people speaking, so he'll spend all week by himself to get his energy up, and then on Sunday he walks into the room and he just raves at people about the kingdom of God. And this is you've only got the one life. Make the right choice. There's the kingdom, there's the empire. The world wants you to go that way, Jesus wants you to go that way, and he's brutal about it. And now he has 5,500 people who sit there entranced. And one year, when it got round to Christmas, he was looking at these Christmas spending numbers and things like that. And he stood up in front of the church and he said, what are you people doing? He said, it's Christmas. Christmas is not your birthday. It's Jesus' birthday. It's not your birthday at all. And what does Jesus want? What did Jesus do? I tell you the truth, whatever you did, whatever you do, for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you do for me. He said, that's what Jesus wants. He wants you to do things for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine. And at the time, what was going on in the world, this was a few years ago when he first did this, was there was a famine and a drought in Sudan. It was really serious. There were people dying all over the place because they had no water, let alone food, had nothing. And so Mike said this to his congregation. He said, here's my idea. I want you to figure out how much you're going to spend on Christmas. Just like that slide I showed you where they broke it down one line at a time. And he said, and when you get a number, I want you to take that number and divide it by 2 and spend that on Christmas. And the other half, I want you to give it to the church, we'll gather it all together and we'll send it to Sudan and we'll put wells in and we'll get water trucks out there and we'll see if we can save the lives of any of these people. And he was dead serious about it. He made it up on the spot, I think, but the next week when people came to church, he handed out cards and said, dear, do your arithmetic. How much on food, how much on gifts, and so on. How much does that, do you really want to spend all of that? Or do you want to do this for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine? So if you're willing to, he said, just cut it in 2, spend that, write a check for the rest, or commit to writing checks for the rest. We'll send it off. That year they raised $400,000 for that. And over the past 5 years, they've raised, it's over 5 million anyway, to help people in places where there are droughts and famines. Of course, we don't have to look all of the way to Sudan for people who are hungry and thirsty and so on and so forth. We can just look over the fence at the end of our property line. Where 1 in 4 children in Lucas County goes to bed hungry at night, right here in this place. You can do this too. You can make a choice for the kingdom and not for the empire. Or you can get your credit card out, get yourself seriously in debt and buy right into what the empire wants you to do. Mike could say Christmas is not your birthday. That's a good book, by the way. I would recommend it to you. Christmas is not your birthday. This is what this parable is actually about. It's a question of allegiance. It's about allegiance to one way of thinking or another way of thinking. And Jesus is holding it up in front of his followers and saying, choose. Or as his namesake Joshua famously said, choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Amen? Amen.